The Watchers in the Void, the Velthrani, had been watching humanity for 3,000 years, and not once had any human ever seen them, Commander. Youth Sarah stood at the observation deck of her ship and looked down at the blue planet below her, the planet that the primitive creatures called Earth. And she felt the familiar sense of superiority that came with being invisible to every living thing in the Bandos galaxy. Her people existed in a state that no other species could understand. A phase-shifted reality where their bodies moved slightly out of sync with normal space and time. And this biological gift made them the perfect observers, the silent judges of the universe she had spent 200 years studying. These humans, and in all that time she had never once worried about being discovered, because discovery was simply impossible. The Velthrani had observed thousands of species across millions of years, and not a single one had ever detected their presence. Not the ancient Korvathi with their advanced technology, not the psychic mindweavers of the Andromeda sector, not even the machine intelligences that could process information faster than light could travel. Humans were certainly not going to be the first. Ethazera watched as her observation teams phased through the walls of human buildings and walked among the crowds of their cities and sat in the rooms where their leaders made decisions that would shape the future of their species. The humans had no idea they were being watched and judged and evaluated. The Galactic Council had given the Velthrani a sacred duty countless ages ago, the duty to observe all emerging species and determine which ones deserved to join galactic civilization and which ones were too dangerous to be allowed to spread among the stars. Humanity was currently under evaluation, and the results were not looking goody. Sarah reviewed the reports from her junior analysts, and she felt a deep concern growing inside her, because these humans were unlike anything she had ever studied before. They were violent and aggressive, and they had developed weapons capable of destroying their own planet. But they were also creative and compassionate, and they had the wonders of art and music and literature that rivaled anything in the known galaxy. They loved each other deeply, and they killed each other constantly. They dreamed of peace, and they waged endless wars. They were a species of contradictions, and Eve Sarah did not know what to make of them. One of her senior analysts, a male named Vethkar, approached her with a tablet containing the latest observations. "Commander," he said in the phase-shifted language of their people that no other species could hear, "the humans have achieved faster than light travel, and they have made contact with the Galactic Council, and they have been invited to their first summit at Nexus Station." Eve Sarah nodded slowly and felt a weight settling on her shoulders. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment when the Galactic Council would ask for her recommendation about the human species. Should they be welcomed into galactic civilization, or should they be contained on their homeworld, or should they be eliminated before they could spread their violence and chaos to the rest of the universe? "Prepare a full observation team," she commanded. "We will attend the summit, and we will watch the humans interact with other species, and we will make our final evaluation." Vethkar bowed and left to carry out her orders, and Ithsera turned back to the observation window and looked at the Earth spinning slowly below her. She thought about all the species she had observed over her long career, the peaceful ones and the aggressive ones, the wise ones and the foolish ones, and she wondered where humanity would fall on that spectrum. People had been doing this work for so long that they had developed a certain arrogance about it, a belief that they understood the universe better than anyone else because they could see everything without being seen. They moved through the halls of power on 1,000 worlds, and they listened to the secret conversations of emperors and presidents, and they knew the hidden truths that no one else knew. They were the invisible hand that guided the fate of species. And they had never once been challenged in that role. Sarah did not know that everything was about to change. Did not know that among the human delegation traveling to Nexus Station, there was a woman who would do what no being in Galactic history had ever done before. She did not know that the era of invisible observation was coming to an end at that moment. On the planet below, a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez was packing her bags for the journey to Nexus Station, and she had no idea that she was about to become the most important human in galactic history. Elena was a xenolinguist, a scientist who studied the theoretical frameworks of communication between species, and she had been added to the diplomatic delegation at the last minute when the original translator had fallen ill. She was not a diplomat, and she was not a politician, and she had never been particularly good at the social games that powerful people played, but she had a gift that she did not fully understand, a strange ability to perceive patterns in the world around her that other people could not see, a sensitivity to things that existed at the edges of normal perception. All her life she had felt like she was being watched, and all her life she had dismissed that feeling as paranoia or imagination. She did not know that her feeling was absolutely correct. She did not know that beings from another dimension had been following her species for thousands of years and taking notes on everything they did. She did not know that she was about to look into the darkness and see something looking back as Elena boarded the transport ship that would take her to Nexus Station. She felt that familiar prickling sensation at the back of her neck, that strange awareness of unseen eyes watching her every move. She shook her head and told herself that she was being foolish and that there was nothing there. But deep in her gut, in that place where humans kept their most ancient instincts, she knew that something was wrong. She just did not know what it was yet. And in the shadows that existed between moments and between dimensions, a young Velthrani analyst named Kethrus watched aboard the ship, and he felt something he had never felt before in his long career as an observer. He felt nervous. There was something about this human that made him uncomfortable. Something in the way her eyes seemed to linger on empty spaces for just a moment too long. Something in the way she tilted her head as if listening to sounds that should have been impossible for her to hear. He told himself that he was imagining things and that humans could not possibly perceive his kind, but he could not shake the feeling that this particular human was different. He could not shake the feeling that she was somehow watching him back. The diplomat who saw too much. Nexus Station was the largest structure Elena had ever seen, and it hung in the void between stars. Like a city made of light and metal, she stepped off the transport ship and felt her breath catch in her throat as she looked around at the impossible diversity of life forms moving through the arrival hall. Creatures with scales and feathers and tentacles and forms that her human brain could barely process. This was the heart of galactic civilization, the place where 100 different species came together to trade and negotiate and build the future of the known universe, and humanity had finally been invited to join them. Lena walked with the rest of the human delegation through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, and she tried to focus on the job she had been sent here to do, the job of helping the diplomats communicate with their alien counterparts. But she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had started the moment she stepped onto the station. A pressure at the edges of her mind, like someone was standing just behind her shoulder and breathing down her neck. She kept turning around and finding nothing there. Kept catching glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision that vanished when she looked directly at it. The other members of the delegation did not seem to notice anything unusual, but Elena had always been different, had always been sensitive to things that other people could not perceive. When she was a child, she had told her mother that there were invisible people watching them from the corners of the room, and her mother had smiled and told her that she had a wonderful imagination when she was a teenager. She had spent hours in the library reading about myths and legends from every culture on Earth. Stories about beings that existed just beyond the edge of human perception. The jinn of Arabian folklore, the fae of Celtic tradition. The Watchers described in ancient religious texts. Every culture had stories about invisible observers, and Elena had always wondered if those stories might contain a grain of truth now. Walking through the halls of Nexus Station, surrounded by proof that humanity was not alone in the universe, she wondered if those ancient stories might have been more than just imagination. The welcome reception was held in a massive chamber, with a domed ceiling that displayed a live view of the stars outside. And Elena stood at the edge of the crowd and watched the various alien species mingle and negotiate and form the alliances that would shape the future of the galaxy. She should have been paying attention to the conversations around her, should have been helping the diplomats navigate the complex social dynamics of interspecies communication. Instead, she found herself staring at the empty spaces between the delegates, the areas where the crowd seemed to thin out for no apparent reason, the spots where her instincts screamed that something was present. Even though her eyes could see nothing there, she noticed that certain alien delegates seemed to avoid walking through those empty spaces, taking slightly longer paths around invisible obstacles. And she wondered if some of the other species could sense what she was sensing. A Corvathi diplomat walked past her, and Elena saw its four eyes flicker briefly toward one of those empty spaces, before quickly looking away. And she knew in that moment that she was not imagining things. There was something there, something that the Corvathi could almost see, something that existed just beyond the edge of normal perception. She began to watch more carefully. Not the delegates she could see, but the spaces where nothing should be. And slowly she began to notice patterns. The empty spaces moved, drifting through the crowd like invisible guests at a party. And they seemed to cluster around certain delegates more than others. Particularly the humans. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that whatever these invisible things were, they were very interested in her species. Excused herself from the reception and returned to her quarters, and she began to write down everything she had observed, filling page after page with notes and diagrams and theories. She pulled up the station's environmental sensors on her personal tablet and began looking for anomalies, tiny fluctuations in temperature or electromagnetic fields or gravitational readings that might indicate the presence of something that should not be there, and she found them scattered throughout. The sensor logs were thousands of tiny anomalies that the station's automated systems had dismissed as calibration errors or background noise. But when Elena mapped them out, she could see a clear pattern emerging. The anomalies moved in deliberate paths, concentrated in areas where important meetings were being held. And they seemed to follow specific individuals. As they moved through the station, someone or something was watching the delegates of Nexus Station, and they were doing it invisibly. Elena worked through the night, cross-referencing the sensor data with her observations from the reception. And by morning, she had developed a theory that should have been impossible. There was another species on the station, a species that existed out of phase with normal reality. And they had been watching everyone without anyone knowing. She thought about the ancient myths she had studied as a child, the stories of invisible watchers that appeared in every human culture. And she realized that those stories might have been describing something real. Humanity had always known they were being watched, had always sensed the presence of unseen eyes following their every move. But they had lacked the framework to understand what they were perceiving. Now Elena had that framework, and she was determined to use it. She began studying the patterns of the anomalies more closely, looking for any clues about the nature of these invisible observers. And she noticed something that made her heart race. The anomalies had a consistent frequency signature, a mathematical pattern that repeated throughout all of the sensor data. And that pattern reminded her of something she had studied in her work on theoretical xenolinguistics. It looked like a language, or more precisely, it looked like a name, a designation encoded in the mathematical relationship between dimensions. Elena spent the next 2 days working on deciphering that pattern, and slowly a word began to take shape in her mind. A word that should have been impossible for any human to know. A word that held power, and in the shadows of her quarters, watching her work with growing alarm, the young analyst Kethros realized that his worst fears were coming true. This human was not just sensing their presence. She was actively trying to identify them. He reported to Commander Youthsera immediately, his face-shifted voice trembling with fear. "She perceives us," he said. "Not fully, not directly. But she is getting closer with every hour that passes, and I do not know how to stop her." The commander dismissed his concerns as paranoia and told him that no three-dimensional being could possibly comprehend the nature of Velthrani existence, but Kethros could not shake the feeling that everything was about to change, and he was right. The name that should not be known, Lena, had not slept in 3 days, and her quarters were covered with papers and diagrams and calculations that would have made no sense to anyone else. She stood in the center of the chaos and stared at the single word she had written on the wall in large letters. The word that had emerged from her analysis of the sensor anomalies and the mathematical patterns and the ancient myths of 100 human cultures. Volthresis did not know what the word meant. Not exactly, but she knew in her bones that it was important, that it was the key to understanding the invisible presence she had been sensing since she arrived on the station. The word had a strange quality to it, a resonance that seemed to vibrate at frequencies beyond normal human hearing. And when she spoke it aloud, she could feel something shift in the air. Around her, she had spent hours studying the structure of the word, breaking it down into its component sounds and analyzing the mathematical relationships between them. And she had come to believe that it was not just a name, but also a location, a frequency, a description of a way of existing that was fundamentally different from normal 3-dimensional reality. If she was right, then speaking the word with the correct intonation and intention might do more than just identify these invisible watchers. It might force them to reveal themselves. Lena knew that what she was about to do was either brilliant or insane, and she was not entirely sure which one it was. She gathered her notes and her courage, and she walked out of her quarters and made her way to the observation lounge on the upper level of the station, a large room with windows that looked out on the stars. The lounge was empty of visible occupants, but Elena could feel the familiar pressure of unseen eyes watching her from the shadows. She stood in the center of the room and took a deep breath and closed her eyes and focused on the word she had discovered, feeling its shape in her mind, understanding its meaning on a level that went deeper than language, and then she spoke it aloud. Velthrani. The word came out of her mouth, not as a simple sound, but as something more. A vibration that seemed to ripple through the fabric of reality itself, touching dimensions that human senses were not designed to perceive. For a moment, nothing happened, and Elena felt foolish, standing alone in an empty room talking to invisible beings that might not even exist. And then air in front of her began to shimmer and twist, and a figure materialized out of nothing. A tall being with silver skin and eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies within them. Commander Youthsera stood before her, visible for the first time in her long existence, her form flickering between solidity and transparency as she struggled to maintain her phase lock against the power of her own name. The commander's face showed an expression that Elena recognized as shock, a universal emotion that transcended the boundaries between species. "How?" Euthsera demanded, her voice echoing strangely, as if coming from multiple dimensions at once. How could you possibly know that word? How could you possibly speak it with enough precision to break our phase lock? How could a primitive three-dimensional being achieve something that no species in galactic history has ever accomplished? Elena smiled and felt a calm certainty settling over her. The certainty of someone who had finally solved the puzzle that had been haunting them for their entire life. Because we have always known you were there, she said. Every human culture on Earth has stories about invisible watchers, beings who observe us from beyond the edges of perception. And those stories were not myths or imagination or superstition. They were memories, she continued, passed down through countless generations. Warnings from our ancestors who sensed your presence, even if they could not see you directly. I simply took those memories and combined them with modern sensor data and mathematical analysis until I found the truth. Euthsera stared at her with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been fear. That should not be possible, she said. Your species lacks the biological architecture to perceive phase-shifted matter. Your senses are limited to a narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. Your brains are not designed to process information from higher dimensions. You are right, Elena agreed. We are limited in all the ways you describe. But we are also stubborn and curious, and we refuse to accept that anything is truly impossible. You hid in our blind spots, she said. So we evolved to pay attention to our blind spots, and we developed instincts that warned us when something was watching from the darkness. You existed beyond our perception, she continued. So we expanded our perception through technology and mathematics and the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human curiosity. You thought you were invisible, she said. And maybe you were, to every other species in the galaxy. But humanity has always had a special relationship with the things that hide in the shadows. We have always looked back. Euthsera was silent for a long moment, and Elena could see other figures beginning to materialize around the room. More Velthrani observers drawn out of their phase-shifted concealment by the power of their own name. There were dozens of them. Silver-skinned beings who had spent millennia watching and judging and deciding the fates of entire species. And now they were visible and vulnerable and uncertain for the first time in their existence. What do you want? Euthsera finally asked. Her voice quieter now. Stripped of its earlier arrogance, Elena thought about the question carefully before answering. I want the truth, she said. I want to know why you have been watching us. I want to know what you have learned about humanity in 3,000 years of observation. And I want to know what you were planning to do with that information. Euthsera's expression shifted, and Elena saw something that surprised her. Something that looked almost like respect. You are more perceptive than I gave you credit for, the commander said. Perhaps more perceptive than any being I have ever encountered. The truth is that we were evaluating your species, she admitted, determining whether humanity should be welcomed into galactic civilization or contained or eliminated before you could spread your chaos and violence to the rest of the universe. Elena nodded slowly, unsurprised by this revelation. And what was your conclusion? She asked. Euthsera was silent for a long moment before answering. We had not reached one yet, she said. Your species is unlike anything we have ever observed. A contradiction wrapped in a paradox. Capable of tremendous destruction and tremendous creation in equal measure. And now, Elena said with a slight smile, you have one more data point to consider. Humans do not like being watched without their knowledge or consent, and we are very good at finding the things that try to hide from us. The weight of being witnessed, the news of what had happened in the observation lounge, spread through the Velthrani fleet faster than light itself. For the first time in their ancient history, they had been seeing Commander Euthsera stood before the emergency council of her people. her form still flickering slightly from the aftereffects of having her phase lock broken by a human speaking her species. True name. The council chamber was filled with the most powerful and ancient members of Velthrani civilization. Beings who had been observing the galaxy since before most current species had crawled out of their primordial oceans. And they were afraid Ithzera could see the fear in their galaxy-filled eyes, could hear it in the trembling of their phase-shifted voices, could feel it in the way they looked at each other as if searching for someone to blame for this catastrophe. How did this happen? Demanded High Observer Methkrol, the oldest and most respected member of the council. How did a primitive species with limited senses and brief lifespans accomplish something that 100 more advanced civilizations failed to achieve? Ithzera straightened her spine and met his gaze without flinching. Because we underestimated them, she said. We observed their violence and their chaos, and their short lives, and we assumed that meant they were simple creatures who pose no threat to our secrecy. We were wrong. Humans are not simple, she continued. They are the most complex and contradictory species I have ever studied, and their apparent limitations hide capabilities that we never anticipated. They cannot perceive phase-shifted matter directly, she explained, but they have developed instincts over thousands of years that allow them to sense when they are being watched, and they have combined those instincts with technology and mathematics to achieve what should have been impossible. They looked into their blind spots and they found us there. The council erupted into chaos as various factions began arguing about what should be done. Some demanded that the human who had discovered their secret be silenced before she could share her knowledge with the rest of her species. Others argued that it was already too late for such measures and that the Velthrani should reveal themselves to the Galactic Council before the humans did it. For theme, a small faction suggested that the entire human species should be eliminated as a threat to Velthrani security. Ithra listened to the arguments and felt a growing sense of disgust with her own people. They had spent millions of years watching and judging other species, deciding who deserved to live and who deserved to die, acting as if they were gods with the right to determine the fates of entire civilizations. And now that someone had finally challenged their power, they were reacting with fear and violence rather than wisdom. Enough, she said, and her voice cut through the chaos with an authority that surprised even her. I have a different proposal. The council fell silent and turned to look at her. I suggest that we meet with the human, she said, not as observers studying a primitive species, but as equals negotiating with a power that has proven itself worthy of respect. She has accomplished something that no being in galactic history has ever done, she continued, and that means humanity has earned the right to be treated as more than just subjects of our observation. High Observer Methkral's eyes narrowed with displeasure. You would have us negotiate with animals, he demanded. You would have us treat these violent, short-lived creatures as if they were our equals. Yes, Ithzera said simply, because they have proven that they are. The debate continued for hours, but eventually the council agreed to allow Ithzera to meet with the human one more time, to determine what she wanted and whether there was any way to contain the damage that had been done. Ithzera returned to Nexus Station and requested a private meeting. With Dr. Elena Vasquez, they met in the same observation lounge where Elena had first spoken the Velthrani name. And this time, Ithzera did not bother to hide her form. She stood before the human in full visibility, her silver skin reflecting the starlight from the windows, her galaxy eyes fixed on this remarkable woman who had done the impossible. Your species should not be capable of this, Ithzera said. Every analysis we have ever conducted suggested that humans were too limited to ever perceive our existence. Elena smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Ithzera uncomfortable. Something that suggested the human knew more than she was saying. You have watched us for 3,000 years, Elena said. And you still do not understand the most important thing about humanity. And what is that? The youth Sarah asked. We are not limited by what we are capable of, Elena explained. We are defined by what we refuse to accept as impossible. Your people evolved the ability to phase shift because it gave you an advantage. She continued. But evolution is slow, and it only responds to the pressures that actually exist. Humanity evolved something different, she said. We evolved the ability to imagine things that do not exist and then make them real. We evolved the stubbornness to keep trying when logic says we should give up. We evolved the curiosity to keep asking questions even when the answers seem impossible to find. You hid in the spaces between dimensions, Elena said. So we expanded our perception to fill those spaces. You existed beyond our senses, she continued. So we built machines to extend our senses and developed mathematics to describe what our machines detected. You thought your invisibility made you safe, she concluded. But invisibility only works against species that accept their limitations. Humanity does not accept limitations. We refuse them. Youth Sarah studied the human for a long moment, seeing her not as a primitive creature to be observed and judged, but as a representative of a species that had just changed the balance of power in the galaxy. What do you want? She asked. And this time the question was not a demand but a genuine inquiry. Elena's smile faded and her expression became serious. I want a seat at the real table, she said. The one where your people decide which species live and which ones die. The one where the true fate of the galaxy is determined. We know that table exists, she continued. We have always known, even when we could not prove it. Even when we could not see the beings who sat around it. Now we can see you, she said. And we want to be part of the conversation. Youth Sarah felt something shift inside her. A change in the way she viewed humanity, and perhaps a change in the way she viewed her own people. That is a significant request, she said. Humanity is a significant species. Elena replied. They stood in silence for a moment. Two beings from different dimensions of existence. And Youth Sarah made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. I will speak to my council, she said, and I will advocate for your position. I cannot promise they will agree, she added, but I can promise that I will try. Elena nodded, and Youth Sarah saw gratitude in her eyes, but also something else. Something that looked like the certainty of someone who had already won. That is all I ask, Elena said. The chance to prove that humanity deserves a place among the powers that shape the universe. I think you have already proven that, Youth Sarah said quietly, and she meant it. The ones who look back the revelation of the Velthrani to the Galactic Council was the most significant event in the Vidya history of known civilization species that had existed for millions of years. Suddenly learned that they had been watched and judged and evaluated since the dawn of their existence. That invisible observers had moved among them and listened to their most secret conversations and influenced the course of their development in ways they had never suspected. Shock rippled through every corner of the galaxy, and nothing would ever be the same again. But even more shocking than the existence of the Velthrani was the manner of their discovery. A single human, a member of a species that had achieved faster than light travel only a few decades earlier, had done what no being in galactic history had ever accomplished. She had looked into the darkness, and she had seen what was hiding there. Elena Vasquez stood before the assembled delegates of 100 worlds, and she felt the weight of their attention pressing down on her like a physical force. The chamber was silent as she prepared to deliver the speech that would define humanity's place in galactic civilization. The speech that would tell the universe what kind of species had just announced itself to the stars. She thought about all the generations of humans who had come before her. The ancestors who had huddled around fires in the darkness and told stories about the things that watched from the shadows. The philosophers and scientists who had dared to imagine that the universe was larger and stranger than anyone had previously believed. The dreamers who had looked up at the stars and refused to accept that they were forever out of reach. She spoke for all of them. You watched us crawl out of the caves. She began, her voice steady and clear. You watched us discover fire and language and the wheel. You watched us build cities and empires and civilizations that rose and fell across thousands of years. You watched us reach for the stars, she continued. And you watched us tear ourselves apart and put ourselves back together over and over again, making the same mistakes and finding the same redemptions that every species must discover on its own. And in all that time, she said, you never once considered that we might be watching back. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the assembled delegates, meeting the eyes of beings from worlds she had never imagined. Species whose very existence was proof that the universe was more wonderful and more dangerous than humanity had ever dreamed. Humanity has a message for every hidden power in this universe, she declared, and her voice rang through the chamber like a bell. We see you. We have always seen you. And we are no longer afraid of the dark, because we have learned to become it. The chamber erupted into a chaos of reaction. Some delegates cheering and some protesting and some simply staring in stunned silence at this small creature who had the audacity to challenge the oldest powers in the galaxy. But Alina was not finished. Velfrani spent 3,000 years observing humanity. She continued when the noise had died down. And in all that time, they learned many things about our species. They learned that we are violent and aggressive, and that we have the capacity to destroy ourselves and everything around us. They learned that we are short-lived and emotional, and that we make decisions based on feelings rather than logic. They learned that we are divided and fractious, and that we spend as much time fighting each other as we do working together. All of these things are true, she admitted, but they are not the whole truth. The Volfrani also learned that we are creative and resilient, and that we can adapt to challenges that would destroy other species. They learned that we love fiercely, and that we dream impossibly, and that we refuse to accept any limitation that does not serve our purposes. And they learned, to their great surprise, that we have the ability to see things that should be invisible, because humans do not accept blind spots. We do not accept that anything is beyond our perception. We do not accept that any truth is too hidden to be discovered. When something hides from us, we hunt for it. When something watches us from the darkness, we light a fire and watch back. This is who we are, she concluded. This is what we bring to the galactic community. Not the power to destroy, though we have that. Not the ambition to conquer, though we have that too. Bring the power to see. We bring the stubbornness to keep looking until we find what we are searching for. We bring the courage to stare into the void and demand that it reveal its secrets. Elena stepped back from on the podium and let the silence stretch out across the chamber. Then Commander Ythsera, visible now and standing among the other delegates as an equal rather than a hidden observer, began to applaud. The sound of her hands coming together echoed through the chamber, and slowly other delegates joined in. First a few, and then dozens, and then the entire assembly. A thunderous acknowledgement of the species that had just changed everything in the months and years that followed. Humanity took its place among the great powers of the galaxy. Dr. Elena Vasquez became the first human ambassador to the Velthrani Concordat, a position that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, but now seemed almost inevitable. The Velthrani themselves were forced to adapt to a universe where they could no longer hide, where their ancient role as silent judges had been transformed into something new and uncertain. Some of them resented the change and longed for the days when They could move unseen through the holes of power others embraced it and found that being seen was not as terrible as they had feared. That visibility brought its own forms of power and influence that they had never explored, and in the vast spaces between stars, other hidden things took notice of what had happened, powers and beings that had existed in secrecy since before the Velthrani had begun their observations. Looked out into the galaxy and saw that humanity had changed the rules. They saw that a species had emerged that would not accept the darkness, that would not tolerate blind spots, that would keep looking and searching and questioning until every secret was revealed. Some of these hidden powers felt fear at this development. Others felt curiosity or anger or admiration, but all of them understood that the universe had shifted in some fundamental way, and that the species responsible for that shift was not going to stop looking until it had found everything there was to find. And on a blue planet, orbiting a small yellow star, billions of humans went about their daily lives, unaware of the role their species had just played in galactic history. They did not know that their ancient instincts, their stories of invisible watchers, their stubborn refusal to accept the limits of their perception, had all combined to produce one woman who had done the impossible. They did not know that they had earned the respect and fear of powers that had shaped the course of civilization since the beginning of time, but perhaps, in some deep and ancient part of their minds, they had always known that they were more than they seemed. Perhaps they had always known that the things watching from the darkness should be afraid of them. After all, humanity had always been very good at looking back.